In Grand Forks, North Dakota, the air was sharp and biting. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones even if you're only outside for a few minutes. The sun had already begun to sink low by late afternoon, casting long shadows across the flat prairie landscape. Winter in this part of the Midwest doesn't ease in gently. It arrives abruptly and it rules everything. For most college students at the University of North Dakota, this was just another weekend before the holiday break. Some were traveling home early, others were crowding into apartments for parties, and many were simply hunkering down against the chill. Sjodin had her own small list of errands to run that day. She had just finished a shift at Victoria's Secret inside Columbia Mall, where she worked part-time and decided to stay and shop for herself. Drew was only 20 years old. In her final year at UND, she had big plans for her life. Born and raised in Pequot Lakes, Minnesota, she was known as the kind of person who never blended into the background. She was creative, lively, and bold, majoring in graphic design with hopes of one day moving to New York City to make her mark. Friends described her as someone who could lift the energy of any room she walked into. She had that rare spark, the type people remember. That afternoon, she browsed the racks, bought a few things, and then stepped out into the early evening air. The cold stung her cheeks as she pulled her coat tighter, phone pressed to her ear. She dialed her boyfriend, Chris, and the sound of his voice warmed her instantly against the winter air. They chatted casually, the kind of conversation couples have 100 times. What she bought, what they'd eat later, the party she was planning to swing by that night. From Drew's perspective, it was a normal walk through a mall parking lot. She clicked her car remote, saw her Oldsmobile's lights flash, and picked up her pace. Around her, the lot was thinning out, daylight fading faster than it seemed only weeks ago. She mentioned something to Chris mid-sentence, and then her voice caught. Did she see something? Someone? Did a shadow move between the rows of cars? Her phone slipped against her ear as her words suddenly broke off. Chris thought maybe she dropped the call. Drew knew better. In that split second, everything changed. A man appeared, fast, sudden, too close. The sound of boots scraping on asphalt, the rush of movement, the sudden weight in the air. Chris redialed. No answer. Drew's phone buzzed in her hand. She could feel it, but she couldn't reach it anymore. At first, there was no alarm. Phones die, service drops. But as the evening wore on, the silence became harder to explain. Drew had plans to meet her friends for a party later that night, something she had been looking forward to, and she never showed. The first hours after Drew went missing were quiet, almost deceptively so. Chris kept trying her phone. Friends assumed maybe she'd gone back to her apartment or stopped by someone else's place before the party. But with every unanswered call, a strange heaviness began to settle in. When Drew didn't show up that night, the worry became impossible to ignore. Her friends called her parents called the police, and soon what had started as one missed phone call spiraled into the unthinkable. Police cruisers pulled into Columbia Mall's massive parking lot, their headlights sweeping across rows of cars that glittered under a crust of frost. They slowed when they reached Drew's red Oldsmobile. It was parked neatly, just as she would have left it. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken glass, no dents or scratches. The car was locked. Inside, her purse sat on the seat, her wallet tucked inside. It was as if she simply stepped away. But Drew hadn't stepped away. The next morning, word spread quickly through the University of North Dakota. Students woke up to texts and calls. Drew hadn't come home. She hadn't gone to class. Her car had been found, but she hadn't. Fear rippled through campus. Girls who normally walked to and from the library in groups of two now refused to go without a crowd. Parents phoned their kids nonstop, begging them to not walk alone, not to go anywhere after dark. Meanwhile, Drew was gone, trapped in the terrifying reality of what was happening to her. She had been overpowered, shoved into a stranger's car, carried away from the life she knew in the span of just minutes. The cold outside was nothing compared to the chill that gripped her inside. The case gained attention almost immediately. Local news reported on the missing student, showing pictures of Drew, her wide smile, her blonde hair, her bright, confident energy. Soon, posters with her face appeared all across Grand Forks and Pequot Lakes. Strangers who had never met her felt drawn to her story, compelled to help. Hundreds of volunteers showed up, then thousands. They trudged through ditches, woods, and frozen fields, their boots breaking crusted snow as they called her name into the wind. Helicopters circled above, and search dogs sniffed trails that went cold far too quickly. And through it all, her family clung to hope. Her mother, Linda, stood before cameras, her voice trembling but steady, begging whoever had her daughter to let her come home. But in the quiet, private hours, they must have feared the truth. Drew had vanished into the dark, and no one knew where she had gone. As the days turned into weeks, investigators began narrowing their focus. Hundreds of tips poured in, but one name kept rising to the surface: Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. Rodriguez was 50 years old, a lifelong resident of Crookston, Minnesota, just an hour's drive from Grand Forks. On paper, he was a recently released offender, supposedly rehabilitated, but anyone who knew his past could see the danger. He wasn't a thief. He wasn't some kid who got caught up in a fight. His entire criminal history revolved around women. Women he stalked, women he tied up, women he assaulted while holding a knife to their throats. One of his earliest victims back in the late 1970s had been dragged from a car and blindfolded. Another in 1980 had been attacked at knife point in broad daylight. The pattern was almost ritualistic: intimidation, control, domination. Experts had warned he showed signs of sexual sadism, a compulsion not just to assault, but to terrify. Yet in May 2003, he walked out of prison after serving 23 years. 6 months later, Drew Sjodin vanished. The FBI joined the case, bringing federal resources, forensic specialists, and profilers who combed through Rodriguez's past. They pieced together his habits, noting how his previous attacks followed a cycle of stalking, abduction, and assault. His release into the community wasn't just risky, it was catastrophic. Neighbors in Crookston described him as odd but quiet, often seen puttering around in his mother's yard or running small errands in town. To them, he was forgettable, but to investigators, he was the embodiment of a predator hiding in plain sight. Still, suspicion wasn't enough. Without a body, without more concrete evidence, the case against him was circumstantial. Investigators knew they had the right man, but proving it, that would be another battle. Meanwhile, forensic teams combed through his maroon Mercury. On the floorboard, they found a knife sheath. The knife was missing, but when the technicians tested it, they discovered microscopic blood traces. The DNA was a partial match to Drew. It was the first hard forensic link tying him to her. Agents had also collected carpet fibers from his car and compared them to samples from Drew's clothing and purse. Later, in court, these fibers would be another thread stitching him to the abduction. But for now, investigators still didn't have Drew. Without her body, the case was fragile. and Rodriguez, silent and unemotional during questioning, wasn't cracking. He insisted he had been to a movie in Grand Forks that day, once upon a time in Mexico. But when detectives pressed him on details, the story unraveled. What time was the showing? Who sold him the ticket? What previews played before the movie? He couldn't answer, and the alibi collapsed. Knowing they didn't have enough yet to charge him with Drew's abduction, investigators made a decision. They would watch Rodriguez around the clock. Unmarked cars parked down the block from his mother's house in Crookston. Plainclothes officers followed him around on errands, noting every moment. Every trip to the grocery store, every walk around the neighborhood, every cigarette on the porch was logged. One officer later admitted, it was eerie. He lived such an ordinary life. You'd watch him buy bread and milk, knowing what he'd done. Behind the scenes, prosecutors began to build a case that would hold in court. They dug into his prison records, pulling old psychiatric evaluations where experts warned his fantasies were escalating. They traced his car's movements on November 22nd, finding witnesses who saw a man matching his description in the mall lot that afternoon. For Drew, those last hours were unimaginable. She never saw the danger until it was too late. The world tipped as she found a hand, hard, clamping against her mouth. Not slack flesh, but iron, something heavy, a blade at her side. The phone dropped silently. Panic surged. She kicked backward, hands clawing at him, but the cold grip was relentless. Her breath fogged the glass as the door snapped shut, a hard seal, burying her screams behind layers of steel. In the car, light drained from the windows. She was pulled down, restrained, hands forced back. Her legs felt weightless. Her body refused to obey. She tried to scream again, but fear plugged her throat. Imagine her confusion at first. What's happening? Why me? Then fear as she realized she was trapped in a stranger's vehicle, the cold December sun fading as the roads stretched east towards Crookston. Rodriguez had used the same tactics as before, binding, blindfolding, silencing his victims. For Drew, there must have been a desperate cycle of thoughts. Will someone see us? Did Chris hear enough to know I'm in danger? Will the police find me? But no one did. By the time Rodriguez pulled off into the fields outside Crookston, the search parties were only just forming in Grand Forks. By mid-December, the community had already believed Rodriguez was the man. The sheriff's department received angry calls from residents demanding to know why he hadn't been arrested. But investigators knew the truth. They were close, but not close enough. Without Drew's body, they risked the case falling apart in court. They needed more. Proof strong enough to survive the defense tearing it apart piece by piece. So they waited. They gathered. They watched. And all the while, the winter deepened. The Red River froze over. Snow piled against the edges of farm fields, and beneath it all, somewhere out there, Drew lay hidden. By April 2004, nearly 5 months after Drew vanished, the brutal North Dakota winter was finally starting to loosen its grip. Snow melted into icy streams along the ditches, and the fields around Crookston began to thaw. That's when searchers, who had never stopped combing the countryside, made the discovery everyone had dreaded. In a ravine outside Crookston, not far from Rodriguez's home, searchers found human remains. It was Drew. What followed was pieced together from months of painstaking investigation and sobering courtroom evidence. Drew's body was discovered with her hands tied behind her back. She was found partially nude from the waist down, indicating an attack of sexual violence. A plastic bag was found placed over her head and ropes wrapped tightly around her neck. Prosecutors reported Drew had been stabbed, her throat slashed, leading to death by asphyxiation, hemorrhage, or exposure. The medical examiner suggested death may have resulted from suffocation via the plastic bag or rope, a fatal throat wound, or exposure to below freezing elements. On appeal, defense experts disputed conclusions of stab wounds or sexual assault, suggesting asphyxiation from cord compression as a more plausible case, and noted decomposition limited forensic clarity. After months of holding against hope, her family and her community were forced to confront the truth. Drew wasn't coming home. The grief was overwhelming, but investigators now had the final piece of their case. What followed would become one of the most closely watched trials in Minnesota's modern history. Because Minnesota doesn't have the death penalty, federal prosecutors stepped in. They argued that Rodriguez had kidnapped Drew in North Dakota and taken her across straight lines into Minnesota, making it a federal crime. That jurisdictional detail meant prosecutors could pursue the harshest penalty available. The courtroom was packed day after day as the trial began in 2006. Jurors listened to chilling testimony about Rodriguez's past, his long history of stalking, assaulting, and attacking women. Psychologists described him as a sexual predator who had never shown signs of rehabilitation. Prosecutors painted a clear and horrifying picture. Rodriguez hadn't just slipped through the cracks of the system. He had walked free, fully prepared to kill again. The evidence against him was damning. The knife sheath found in his car, the traces of Drew's DNA, witnesses who saw his suspicious vehicle in the Columbia Mall parking lot that day. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together until the jury was left with no doubt. When the verdict was read, guilty of kidnapping resulting in death, the courtroom was silent except for the quiet sobs of Drew's family. And then came the sentence: death. It was the first federal death penalty handed down in Minnesota in 100 years. For Drew's parents, Linda and Alan, the conviction was both a relief and a fresh wound. Justice had been served, but it would never bring back their daughter. Instead of retreating to the grief, they turned their pain outward, fighting for change so that no other family would suffer like theirs. Their advocacy pushed lawmakers to confront a major flaw in the system. Rodriguez had been released from prison just 6 months before Drew's abduction, despite his violent history. He was supposed to be rehabilitated. He wasn't. In 2006, Congress passed the Sjodin National Sex Offender Public Registry. For the first time, Americans could search a single online database to see if convicted offenders were living in their neighborhoods. It was a massive shift in how the country monitored sexual predators, and it carried Drew's name. Her legacy became more than just a law. On college campuses, safety measures were re-examined. Communities across the Midwest built stronger networks for supporting missing persons searches. Drew's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even in safe, quiet towns, danger can lurk. And for those who knew her, the registry and the courtroom outcomes were only a part of it. To them, Drew wasn't a victim or a headline. She was the daughter who filled rooms with laughter, the friend who never let anyone feel alone, the young woman with dreams of New York and a future full of possibilities. Her case ended with the harsh reality of violence and loss, but it also left behind a legacy of reform, awareness, and vigilance. In a way, Drew's light continues to shine, not only in the memories of those who loved her, but in the protections that now exist for countless others.